G'day everybody, my name is Elliot Waters and you're listening to the Dysregulated podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. So today's episode is titled Regression, and that's because yesterday we had a little bit of a mental health incident. Now, and it's frustrating because this is probably the first sort of proper one since coming out of hospital a couple of, 2 months ago. So that's a bit disappointing, and it goes to show that the fight still continues, even if there's been a bit of a lull period from my enemy. It's still hanging around. These mental illnesses are still hanging around, that is for sure. Now, all week I've sort of felt it brewing a bit around the edges of my consciousness. 2 days ago I remember thinking, right, there is this persistent sort of supercharged feeling that I've got, and that to me tells me that there's something BPD related going on, and that's exactly what happened. So yesterday was not, to be honest, today's not particularly good either. It's been a few big weeks, and I think it's all sort of come to a head now, but yeah, not good. I'll admit I cried manly tears, and not only did I cry manly tears, I did it in front of someone as well. I just want to do a little shout out to my friend Larry. Thank you, mate, for coming over and sitting there and just listening to me babble on. You definitely saved what could have been a much worse situation. So thank you very much for that. And this is why it's so important to have such wonderful support, such wonderful friends that are looking out for you. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing going on to do with the S word, the real scary S word. It was not to that extent, but you may remember an episode I did a little while ago called Siege Mentality. And I think in that episode I was talking about how I felt like the world was against me and that I wasn't getting out what I was putting in. And that's pretty much that was essentially the theme of this sort of little meltdown thing, was the fact that I feel like that we're trying really, really hard, but we're just not getting traction. And I'm a little bit worried that we're going to run out of puff before we've got some of the good wins under our belt, and then we won't have the strength or fortitude when things do get considerably tougher when certain things happen. That's just the way it is. Life's going to throw up different challenges, and I'd like to have some things going pretty good in my world to use as a buffer against those sorts of negative emotions, cognitions, thoughts and behaviours. So that's how it started, but that's not how it finished though. Now, I haven't spoken too much on this podcast yet about, my teenage years, but I'll tell you what, that's the meat of it right there. It's the teenage years. And this teenage sort of way of thinking that I still succumb to quite often, which is all to do with self-esteem problems, insecurities, all that sort of jazz. But unfortunately, there are issues that developed when I was about 16 years old in year 10 that have not gone away and have gotten worse. And yesterday sort of started as a meltdown about my current predicament and events that are happening or maybe not happening at present and how frustrating that is. But it ended up going back to around age 16, teenage, high school years, and the themes and issues that sort of sprung out for there. And inevitably, if these sorts of negative moods really take a hold and I'm not able to really push back, the longer it goes on, the more chance we're eventually going to come back to me being 16. And that's why it's so important that I get into therapy. And that's why it's so important that you join the Patreon today. Join the Patreon at www.patreon.com/Elliot Waters. $10 a month helps me get back into therapy, and you can support the podcast that supports you. Anyway, enough of that. So, but it's important I get back into therapy because, these self-esteem things, these memories from back then, these high school issues, as I say in the presentations when I go and talk to high school kids about this sort of stuff, it's as strong as ever, if not stronger, and you can't medicate this sort of stuff. You just can't. You can't medicate personality. This stuff is very intertwined with BPD because I think the events in particular of when I was around 16 really fostered this borderline personality that I have. You cannot medicate personality. You just can't, which is a real shame. Trust me, I've tried. I've tried every medication. If you haven't listened to the older episodes, I think we've tried 29 or 30 medications now, and none of them have even begun to scratch the surface of the BPD components of my psyche, because that is core fundamental personality stuff, and you cannot, I'll say it again, medicate personality. You just can't. But that's why it's important to go to therapy, because there are things that are still holding me back in a huge, huge way that happened 16 years ago. I'm 32, and the irony is not lost that, 16 plus 16 equals 32. Half my life ago is when this sort of stuff was going on. And here we are at 32, and the same rubbish is still plaguing us. And plaguing us it is. And, I'm not going to go into the specifics now because, well, to be honest, I don't have the ability, I think, to go through that stuff without crumbling again. I want to try and avoid all that. So maybe not. No, I feel okay today, but still, it's very raw, very, very, I've still got to work a lot of this stuff out and try and conceptualize what's really going on before we go into the specifics, because I really want to have a good handle on it before I try and explain what's going on. I forgot what I was going to say. There's the ADHD brain again. Geez, my memory's been bad lately. My short-term memory has been absolutely atrocious. It has been so bad. And my sort of medium, I don't know what medium-term memory, that, let's say, if someone said, hey, Elliot, what'd you do last weekend? Well, I'm thinking about it now. I am really struggling to recall, and I still can't as I'm talking here. I still can't recall last weekend. What I did last weekend. I know the Cambridge farewell was that last weekend, or was that the weekend before last? I don't know. It all blends into one. But yeah, memory. I wasn't going to talk about memory, but oh well, we're doing it now. My memory is absolutely atrocious, and it's starting to become a worry. At the start it was sort of funny, ha ha ha. Elliot's repeating stories. Did I already say that? You're joking. Sorry, mate. It was funny maybe the first time. But ever since, it's getting more and more concerning, and it's really, really not good. I don't think there's a correlation or an association between me regressing back to this negative mood state and the memory sort of things that are going on. I think the memory's doing its own thing and the mood's doing its own thing. But there's no two ways about it. Mood disorders, let's say, like depression and anxiety, both of them, are disastrous for one person's memory. Because, right, if you're really depressed, in your world, your reality is just all bad. It's all bad. Your brain shuts off. It doesn't want to remember that stuff. And when you're anxious, well, it's a similar sort of thing. But I think with anxiety, I'm trying to remember, I think there's something about the fight or flight or freeze response where adrenaline shuts. I'm going to have to look into this. Something about shutting off parts of the brain to redirect energy maybe to other parts. Probably like the amygdala, for example, my favorite brain region, which is all about sensing and looking out for threats. So I might double check that. I'll get back to you on that one. But anxiety certainly has memory issues around it as well. So, and BPD does too, in these really high emotional states, you sort of disassociate a bit. And I was doing that a little bit yesterday, when the tears were flowing, those manly tears. I was doing a bit of disassociating. I was like, holy jeez, it's been 3 hours. It felt like 30 minutes. Larry, I'm so sorry that you have to listen to all this rubbish. And I shouldn't say rubbish. This is real life. This is why I said to him towards the end, when everything was a bit clearer and was sort of coming down a bit. I said to him that these thoughts that I was having yesterday about certain things, which I'll go into in the future, but related to when I was 16, these are obsessive. They don't stop. Go listen to Obsessive Intrusive Thoughts, Negative Thoughts, that episode. It's very much that sort of stuff. But you can't tell me that these thoughts aren't real. People say, oh, they're just thoughts. I hate that, because these thoughts, I can feel my brain feels like it's on fire, There's all this adrenaline pumping. It feels like you get repeatedly kicked in the guts. Like you can't, your heart's fluttering, sweating. And then there's all just the feeling that the weight of the world's on your shoulders. And there's much more, of course, but and the tears. Did I mention the tears? I cried, okay? I cried. And you cannot tell me that stuff isn't real. It is as real as any other experience I have. So, it's serious, serious stuff. And yesterday was a bit scary because I felt a little bit, it really reminded me of those trips up the hospital. I was like, I'm in that sort of realm again. I didn't fall that low, thank goodness. But, and again, support networks so important, because who knows, if I was on my own, maybe I would have taken myself up there. Hopefully not. Hopefully that wouldn't have been required, but it goes to show how important your support networks are, that's for sure. But this was real, and this was the first time since probably Ijmu in hospital, my last hospital admission. It's probably the first time that I've felt in that realm again. And I'll tell you what, I do not like the feeling. It is scary. It scares the living daylights out of me. And that was probably the main emotion. When I went to bed last night, my main emotion wasn't sadness or I don't know, anger or irritability or melancholy sort of stuff. It was fear. I was petrified that we were regressing back to where we were a couple of months ago, because I'll tell you, I cannot, if I can help it, cannot go through some of those dark times again. I know things aren't going to be easy moving forward, definitely not, and I don't want them to be, or else where's the great achievement in that? But at the same time, there have been some really dark days, and I'll tell you what, yesterday reminded me all about how bad and dark those days really were. So very, very scary as I went to bed last night. And I might add, I'm back here living with me family because I need to save money. Join the Patreon if I haven't mentioned that yet. I know I have. Anyway, but please join if you can. But my parents are away, so I'm the only one in the house, and it felt lonely. And that was the loneliness, that void I was feeling just because there was no one else at home. Such a BPD response again. And then everything sort of split from that, there's this general feeling of, there's no one here, it's a bit lonely, which is just a simple thing, everyone would think something like that. But it did cascade and spiral down negatively to the whole BPD, I'm on my own, unlovable, all that sort of stuff. So, yesterday was a bit of a doozy, because not only did we fall into the sort of sadness trap, but we also fell into sort of the BPD sort of trap. And the OCD was a big part of it too. These obsessive thoughts, they've been building and building and building over the last few days. And eventually you break. And that was what happened yesterday, because I wasn't able to introduce a circuit breaker to get back on top. And that's something I need to really work on moving forward as well, is that we know we're going to have moments like this. It's just the way it is, Whether it's genetics, whether it's environment, who cares? The fact of the matter is these days are going to happen, hopefully a lot less frequently than in the past, but I need to be prepared for the next one. So it's now my job to try and figure out what it is I could have done better, what it is I could have done full stop, and try and come up with an action plan that is simple. ADHD said don't want too much complexity. That is simple, that's written out on a piece of paper, so it's all there, so I know exactly what I've got to do. They call it a risk. It's like a risk management plan. There's a proper name for it. And there's a really good one on the Black Dog Institute website, actually. I can't remember. Anyway, I might put a link on social media because it's a really good exercise, really good tool to really get comfortable with the steps that need to be taken if, unfortunately, we succumb to some of these negative thoughts. Anyway, that is my story for today. I'm glad I got that out, got that off my chest. I'll say it again, I was crying manly tears, and you know what? I don't care, because this stuff is as real as it gets. And when you've got wave after wave after wave of negative emotion just spilling over, well, there's a few options that you could do. And let's put it this way, if crying's the worst of them, that's pretty good. I can handle that. That's not too bad. All right, thank you everybody for listening. As always, feel free to reach out if you'd like to. You can follow me on Instagram at elliot.t.waters, and you can follow the show at the dysregulated.podcast, and you can support the show financially and me to get back into therapy, www.patreon.com/Elliot Waters. All right, until next time, see you later.